In the bitter winter of 1883, Wyoming, a wealthy rancher rode home after 3 months away, only to discover the woman caring for his dying parents held a devastating truth about who he'd become. What happens when guilt, redemption, and unexpected love collide in the frozen wilderness? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful Western tales of healing and second chances that will restore your faith in the human heart. She's doing what I failed. Rancher returns home to find a stranger saved his family. The wind cut through Lucas Bennett like a surgeon's blade, precise and merciless. His gelding stumbled through snow that rose past the horse's chest, each step a negotiation with winter's unforgiving grip. February in Wyoming wasn't just cold, it was personal, the kind of cold that found every gap in a man's armor and reminded him he was mortal. 3 months. 3 months since he'd seen his parents, since he'd bothered to ride the 40 miles from his sprawling empire to their modest homestead. 3 months of burying himself in cattle contracts, land acquisitions, expansion plans, anything to keep moving, anything to avoid the stillness that brought memories flooding back. The Bennett Ranch now sprawled across 3 territories. Lucas's bank account could buy half of Cedar Ridge and most of the surrounding county. He employed 37 men, owned over 2,000 head of cattle, and lived in a house with 12 rooms that echoed with his footsteps. Success by any measure. Empire by most standards. Emptiness by the only one that mattered. The thought slithered through his mind like smoke, and Lucas pushed it away with practiced efficiency. He focused instead on the landscape, the familiar ridge of pines bent under snow, the frozen creek bed where he'd learned to fish as a boy, the outcropping of rock that marked the turnoff to his parents' land. Except old Jack Miller stood at that turnoff, one gnarled hand raised like a warning. Lucas pulled his gelding to a halt. Jack was 70 if he was a day weathered as driftwood, tough as railroad ties. The old man had been part of Wyoming since before Wyoming had a name, and his presence here now in a blizzard meant something. Jack. Lucas touched the brim of his hat, snow cascading from the gesture. Lucas. Jack's eyes were sharp beneath bushy white brows, no warmth in them. Been expecting you'd show up eventually. The words carried weight, accusation wrapped in observation. Lucas felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. My parents, ain't it at the homestead? Jack's weathered face remained impassive. Been up at the Hayes widow's place since Christmas, near as I can tell. Lucas stared. The Hayes, you mean the veterinarian's widow? Grace Whitmore married name, Rebecca Hayes born name. Jack shifted his weight and his horse snorted protest at the cold. Her husband was Doc Samuel Hayes. Fever took him 2 winters back. She kept the cabin, kept herself, and now she's keeping your folks alive while you've been playing cattle baron. The words landed like physical blows. Lucas opened his mouth, closed it. Snow fell between them, soft and relentless. Up the ridge, Jack said, pointing with his chin toward a stand of aspens barely visible through the storm. Small cabin smoke from the chimney. You'll know it. He paused, and something that might have been pity crossed his face. They're alive, Lucas, but that ain't thanks to you. Then he was gone, swallowed by the white curtain of falling snow, leaving Lucas alone with his gelding and a growing sense of dread that sat in his chest like a stone. The cabin appeared through the storm like a painting from a fever dream. Small, maybe 3 rooms at most, with rough-hewn logs dark against the endless white, but smoke curled from the chimney, warm and welcoming. Golden light glowed through frost-rimmed windows. Lucas dismounted his boots, sinking into snow that reached his knees. He should announce himself, should knock, should do something civilized. Instead, he moved to the window drawn by something he couldn't name. Through the glass, his mother sat at a rough wooden table, her silver hair loose over one shoulder. She was laughing, actually laughing, the sound muffled but unmistakable. A woman in a simple brown dress, patches carefully sewn on the sleeves, flour dusting an apron that had seen better years, ladled stew into wooden bowls with practiced efficiency. His father's bent shoulders hunched over his plate, but Lucas saw his weathered hand rest gently, tenderly on the woman's wrist as she passed. A gesture of gratitude, of connection, of something Lucas hadn't seen in his father's movements in years. The stranger turned slightly, and Lucas caught a glimpse of her profile. Dark hair pulled back severely, a face neither young nor old, but carved by something experience, lost determination. She moved with quiet competence, no wasted motion, like someone who'd learned to make every gesture count. An empty rocking chair sat by the fire as if waiting. Shame crashed over Lucas like an avalanche. This stranger, this woman he'd never met, was doing what he should have done. Feeding his parents, keeping them warm, making them laugh. While he'd been calculating profit margins and expanding his empire, someone else had become family. His hand moved toward the door latch, breath forming clouds in the bitter air. Inside, his mother's laughter rang out again, warm and genuine. Lucas hadn't heard that sound since before Caroline died, since before the baby. He shoved the thought away. The door swung open before he could decide whether to knock. Cold air flooded the cabin like an invasion. The woman stood in the doorway, wooden spoon in hand, her dark hair now visible as having threads of premature silver. Her eyes were green, spring grass, green, life green, but they held a sharpness that made him step back instinctively. "Mr. Bennett." Not a greeting, an accusation flat and cold as the winter wind. Behind her, his mother gasped. "Lucas." Eleanor Bennett rose from the table, joy and hurt warring across her weathered face, creating an expression so complex it broke something in Lucas's chest. His father didn't stand, didn't even turn around, just kept his eyes fixed on his bowl as if it held answers. "Ma." Lucas stepped inside, pulling off his hat. Snow melted on the floorboards, forming small puddles that reflected the firelight like accusations. "Pa." The woman, Rebecca Hayes, he reminded himself, closed the door behind him with more force than necessary. She set another bowl on the table without a word, movements tight and controlled, like someone holding back something sharp and dangerous. "Sit." His mother's voice, soft but insistent, gestured to the waiting rocking chair. Lucas sat. The cabin was smaller than his parlor back at the ranch, hell smaller than his bedroom. One main room really, with a loft overhead, accessible by a ladder. But it was warm, meticulously clean, filled with the rich scent of venison stew and fresh bread. His stomach clenched with hunger and something deeper, a longing for the simple comfort he'd forgotten existed, had maybe never properly appreciated. "I came as soon as I could," he started, then stopped. The lie tasted bitter, even unfinished. He could have come weeks ago, months ago, should have come before they'd been driven to seek shelter with a stranger. "We got your letters," his father said, voice rough as gravel, still not looking up. "Thomas Bennett, William." Lucas corrected himself mentally. His new name had been a giant once, all broad shoulders and calloused hands that could gentle a spooked horse or build a barn frame. Now he seemed to have folded in on himself, made smaller by age and disappointment, and something Lucas was afraid to name. "Paper don't fill an empty belly," William continued. "Don't keep a fire lit neither." Lucas flinched as if struck. Rebecca ladled stew into his bowl and set it down with deliberate care, the ceramic clicking against the wood with a sound like judgment. "Eat." Not an invitation, a command. The stew was better than anything his cook had ever made, rich with herbs he couldn't identify and meat that fell apart at the touch of his spoon. Carrots and potatoes soft and savory. It was simple, perfect, made with care by hands that knew scarcity. It tasted like ashes in his mouth. "How long have they been here?" Lucas asked, looking directly at Rebecca. "Since December." Her voice remained curt-clipped, each word chosen for maximum efficiency. "Found them trying to keep their fire lit in that cold house of yours. The chimney was blocked, birds had nested in it all fall, and you didn't bother to check. The wood pile was empty. They'd been burning furniture to stay warm." The image hit Lucas like a fist. His parents, elderly and frail, breaking up chairs to feed a dying fire. While he'd been in his study, feet propped near a roaring fireplace, reviewing acquisition contracts. "And you've been taking care of them, feeding them." Her jaw tightened, a muscle jumping. "Keeping them warm, keeping them breathing. That's all." Lucas reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. Coins clinked inside, $100 at least, maybe more. He set it on the table between them like an offering. "Let me pay you, it's the least I can do." Rebecca's eyes went ice-cold, glacial, terrifying in their controlled fury. "The least would have been showing up, Mr. Bennett." She turned her back on him, shoulders rigid with anger barely contained. "This isn't a transaction. You can't buy decency." Silence fell like a hammer blow. His mother reached across the table and touched Rebecca's hand, a gesture of solidarity, of choosing sides that cut deeper than any words could have. His father still hadn't looked at him, and Lucas wondered if William ever would again. Lucas set the pouch down slowly, coins inside seeming to mock every choice he'd made. "I'm sorry." Rebecca didn't turn around. "Sorry doesn't keep people from freezing to death." The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. The fire crackled and popped, sending shadows dancing across the walls like ghosts of what should have been. Lucas realized with crushing clarity that he was the outsider here, the stranger in what should have been his own family circle. The intruder. The failure. The son who'd valued empire over presence, who'd measured love in dollar amounts, and found it cheaper to send money than to show up. "I'll stay," he said quietly, "if you'll have me, just until the storm passes." Rebecca finally turned her green eyes, assessing him with the cold calculation of someone who'd learned not to trust easy promises. "Storm's supposed to last 3 days." A pause heavy with unspoken things. "You can sleep in the loft. You'll work for your keep. I don't take charity, and I don't give it either." "I understand. Do you, She moved past him to the fire, stirring the pot with more force than necessary. "Because understanding and doing are two different things, Mr. Bennett. And so far, all I've seen from you is an expensive coat in empty hands." That night, Lucas lay in the loft on a thin mattress that smelled of cedar and wool, listening to the wind scream. Below, he could hear the soft murmur of his mother's voice, the occasional rumble of his father's response, the quiet efficiency of Rebecca banking the fire for the night. He stared at the rough-hewn beams overhead, at the gaps where wind whistled through, and thought about the house he'd built with 12 rooms that no one lived in, about the nursery that had waited 6 months before he had locked it away, about Caroline's grave, which he visited once a year on the anniversary because anything more felt like drowning, about the empire he'd built on the foundation of running away. Sleep, when it came, brought dreams of empty rooms and empty cradles, and a baby's cry that cut off too soon, replaced by silence that rang louder than any scream. Lucas woke before dawn to the sound of someone chopping wood. He descended the ladder quietly, found his boots by the door, and stepped out into the pre-dawn darkness. Rebecca stood by a chopping block, her breath forming clouds in the bitter air. She'd already split half a cord, the pile of wood growing steadily beside her. Her movements were precise, efficient, swing split stack. Swing split stack, a rhythm born of necessity and practice. "Let me," Lucas said. She didn't stop, didn't acknowledge him. Swing split stack. "I said let me." "And I heard you." Another log split cleanly. "Words are easy, Mr. Bennett. Let's see how you do with an axe." She handed it to him, and their hands touched briefly. Hers were callous, scarred, the hands of someone who'd worked for survival. His were soft from signing contracts, from shaking hands with bankers, from holding reins and nothing heavier. The first swing went wide, bouncing off the log. The second hit true but didn't split through. The third finally worked, but his shoulders already burned. Rebecca watched without comment, arms crossed against the cold. After 20 minutes, Lucas's hands had blistered. After an hour, they bled. He kept swinging. "Enough," Rebecca's voice cut through his concentration. "You'll be useless if you cripple yourself." She took his hands in hers, examining the damage with the clinical detachment of a healer. Her touch was impersonal, efficient, but Lucas felt it like electricity. She led him back inside, sat him at the table, and began treating his wounds with a competence that spoke of experience beyond basic frontier first aid. "You've done this before," he observed, watching her work. The way she cleaned the wounds, the precise pressure of the bandaging, the knowledge in her movements. Life teaches many things. Non-answer, deflection. But her hands didn't falter. His mother appeared from behind a curtain that divided off a sleeping area. "Rebecca was a nurse," Eleanor said softly, then caught Rebecca's sharp look. "During the war, she saved lives when doctors couldn't." Rebecca's hands stilled on Lucas's for just a moment. Then she resumed, wrapping tighter than necessary. Ancient history. But Lucas had seen the flicker in her eyes, pain memory. Something vast and unspoken. He looked down at his palms, at the bandages being applied by hands that had seen battlefields, had held dying men, had learned healing in the crucible of war. "Thank you," he said quietly. She released his hands like they'd burned her. "You'll need to milk the goat. Can you do that, or should I add it to your list of skills money can't buy?" The goat, it turned out, was a cantankerous beast named Prudence, who had opinions about Lucas's technique, He'd never milked anything in his life, had never needed to, had people who handled such practicalities while he managed the business of running an empire. His father appeared beside him, silent as a ghost. William's weathered hands covered Lucas's, guiding the grip, showing the gentle pressure needed. Like this, firm but kind. She needs to know you mean business, but you ain't gonna hurt her. They worked in silence, the only sound the rhythmic splash of milk hitting the pail, and Prudence's occasional snort of opinion. When the pail was full, William straightened his hand, resting briefly on Lucas's shoulder. Your mom missed you, was all he said. Then he shuffled back toward the cabin, leaving Lucas alone with the goat and the growing realization of just how much he'd lost while building his empire. The days developed a rhythm. Lucas learned to haul water from the creek, breaking through ice with an axe, the cold so sharp it made his teeth ache. He learned to mend broken tools, following William's quiet instructions and discovering the patience it took to make something whole again instead of just buying a replacement. He learned to recognize the plants Rebecca used for medicine, the herbs she dried for cooking, the careful stewardship required to make limited resources last through an endless winter. And he learned to make bread. Rebecca stood beside him at the rough table, her hands working dough with practiced ease. Push with your palms, not your fingers, she instructed, demonstrating the motion. Her hands moved with a dancer's grace, folding and pressing, creating order from chaos. Like this, Lucas tried. The dough stuck to his hands, refusing to cooperate, accusing him of incompetence. You're too gentle, Rebecca observed, and he caught the hint of amusement beneath the criticism. Bread needs strength. It needs to know you mean business. He pressed harder, putting his weight behind it. Gradually, miraculously, the dough began to come together under his palms, smooth and elastic and alive. Better. And there in that single word was approval. Small, grudging, but real. Their hands worked the dough in silence for a while, occasionally touching as they folded and pressed. Each contact felt electric, significant, like touching a wire carrying current from somewhere vast and unknowable. Why are you doing this? Lucas asked quietly. Taking care of strangers, sharing what little you have. Rebecca's hands stilled. When she spoke, her voice carried weight. Because someone did it for me once. After Samuel died, after the bank threatened to take everything, old Jack brought me firewood every week for a year. Didn't ask, didn't want thanks, just stacked it by my door and left. She resumed kneading. Said the world had enough taking in it. He wanted to be part of the giving. And my parents, found them by accident, was bringing your ma some preserves and heard them trying to get that chimney working. Could hear the desperation. Her jaw tightened. Your pa was burning one of your ma's good chairs, the one her mother made her. They were choosing between warmth and memory, Mr. Bennett, all while you were where buying another ranch, counting another herd. The accusation hung between them like smoke. I was running, Lucas admitted, the words dragged from somewhere deep. From a house too big and too quiet. From a nursery I couldn't bear to enter. He stopped, the next words catching in his throat. From grief. Rebecca's voice had softened just barely. I know what that looks like. But running doesn't make it lighter. It just means you carry it alone. His mother's voice drifted from the rocking chair, by the fire, singing a hymn in Welsh, something from her childhood, ancient and beautiful. His father sat nearby, whittling a piece of pine, the knife, moving with steady sureness, creating something useful from raw wood. For the first time in 2 years, Lucas felt something in his chest that wasn't the familiar weight of grief. It was smaller, more fragile, but undeniably there. Hope, maybe, or the memory of what hope felt like. But their supplies were dwindling with mathematical certainty. The flour sack hung limp against the wall. The salt jar showed bottom. Rebecca measured the coffee with increasing care, making each pot weaker than the last. Lucas watched her portion out the stew that evening, giving his parents larger servings, taking almost nothing for herself. When she thought no one was looking, she added hot water to her bowl to make it seem fuller. I'll ride to town tomorrow, Lucas announced. Buy what we need. Rebecca's spoon stilled over her bowl. We're fine. You're not fine. You're rationing. I can see it. I said we're fine. Her voice carried warning now. But Lucas had seen the truth in the way she counted beans and how she eyed the remaining flour and the calculation behind her every movement. I have money. Let me help. With money, Rebecca set down her spoon with exaggerated care. Always money with you people. Like it solves everything. Like it's a substitute for being here, for caring for. She stopped, visibly pulling herself together. We're fine. But that night, Lucas heard her in the kitchen, counting supplies with quiet desperation. He lay in the loft, listening to her whisper calculations, hearing the fear beneath the competence. Pride, he realized. She'd rather starve than accept what felt like charity. Would rather watch them all slowly diminish than bend. He understood that. He'd built his entire empire on pride, on the need to be self-sufficient, to never need anyone, to wall off the vulnerability that came with connection. Look where it had brought him. Before dawn, while everyone slept, Lucas saddled his gelding and rode through the deep snow to Cedar Ridge. The general store was barely open, but Henry Garrett unlocked the door early when Lucas knocked, because Lucas Bennett's money spoke louder than inconvenience. He bought flour, salt, coffee, sugar, lamp oil, medicine for winter ailments. He paid extra for rush delivery to Rebecca's cabin, told Garrett to say it was winter supplies from the community. The lie tasted bitter, but it was for a good cause. When he returned, the sun was just rising, painting the snow gold in pink. He'd make it back before anyone noticed he was gone. 2 days later, Rebecca found the receipt. She'd been saddling Lucas's horse he had offered to teach her to ride better, a peace offering she'd grudgingly accepted when it fell from his saddlebag. A single piece of paper, itemized damning, $70. Lucas was in the lean-to mucking out Prudence's stall when Rebecca appeared in the doorway. Her face was flushed, whether from cold or fury he couldn't tell. "What is this?" She held up the receipt like evidence of a crime. "It's nothing. It's $70. Her voice shook, not with gratitude, but with rage, barely contained. "You think I'm some kind of charity case? Some poor widow who needs the rich man to save her? No, I've survived worse than your pity, Mr. Bennett." She crumpled the receipt in her fist. "I survived war. I survived losing my husband. I survived winter after winter on my own, and I didn't need—" Her voice cracked. "I didn't ask for your help." Lucas set down the pitchfork carefully. "I know you didn't, but you needed it. There's a difference." "Not to me." She threw the crumpled receipt at him. It bounced off his chest, fell into the dirty straw. "To me, accepting that would mean I'm not strong enough, that I can't take care of the people who depend on me, that I'm—" She stopped, blinking hard. "Human," Lucas suggested quietly. "That you're one person trying to shoulder burdens meant for many. I don't need a sermon from someone who abandoned his parents to play cattle baron." The words hit like a slap. Lucas absorbed them, nodded slowly. "You're right. I have no moral authority here. I've failed in every way that matters." He stepped closer, saw her tense. "But I'm trying to learn. From you. From how you turn scarcity into abundance through sheer will. How you give when you have nothing left to give." Rebecca's eyes glistened suspiciously. "Pretty words. True words." He paused, then took a risk. "Your father's coat has a torn sleeve. I notice you mending everyone else's clothes, but never your own. The patch on your apron is worn through. You're so busy taking care of everyone that you're falling apart, and you won't let anyone help because helping means weakness to you." She stared at him, chest heaving. Lucas reached into his pocket and pulled out a needle and thread, Rebecca's own supplies borrowed from her sewing basket. "Teach me to mend the coat properly. Then we'll talk about charity and pride and who gets to help whom." Rebecca took the supplies with shaking hands. "You'll do it wrong. Then you'll teach me to do it right." For a long moment, they stood there in the animal smell warmth of the lean-to snow, falling outside the world, reduced to this small space and smaller understanding. "Fine," Rebecca said, finally, a voice rough. "But if you think this means I'm accepting that money, I think it means that we're both learning that asking for help isn't weakness, it's wisdom." She snorted, but Lucas caught the ghost of a smile before she turned away. That evening by firelight, Rebecca showed Lucas how to mend William's coat sleeve. Her hands guided his patient despite her earlier anger, showing him the proper stitch, the right tension, the care required to make something broken whole. Their fingers touched with each stitch. Neither pulled away. Outside, the storm had finally broken. Stars appeared through thinning clouds, sharp and cold and beautiful. Inside, something else was breaking walls, carefully constructed, pride that had become prison loneliness, that had felt safer than risking connection. Lucas pulled thread through fabric and felt like he was stitching something back together in himself too, something he'd thought lost forever. The Sunday after the storm broke, Rebecca walked to Cedar Ridge for supplies, as she did every week. The 6-mile trek through snow-packed roads had become routine, a time for thinking, for breathing air that wasn't shared in a crowded cabin, for pretending she was still the self-sufficient woman she'd been before 3 near strangers had turned her solitary life into something uncomfortably communal. The general store sat on Main Street between the land office and the saloon, its false front painted cheerful yellow that looked garish against the endless white. Rebecca had been buying supplies on credit here for 2 years, paying it back with preserves, sewing work, and occasional medical assistance, when Henry Garrett's extensive family required doctoring. It was an arrangement that worked for everyone, a frontier economy built on trust and necessity. But when Rebecca pushed open the doorbell, jangling overhead, she knew immediately something had changed. The conversation stopped mid-sentence. 3 women clustered near the dry goods: the mayor's wife, the banker's wife, and Mrs. Blackwood, the reverend's wife, turned to stare with expressions Rebecca recognized from the war judgment, wrapped in righteousness, condemnation dressed as concern. Henry Garrett stood behind the counter, his usually friendly face now carefully neutral. Mrs. Hayes, formal, distant, not Rebecca as it had been for 2 years. Mr. Garrett, she matched his tone, pride stiffening her spine. I need 2 pounds of flour and half a pound of coffee, please. On account as usual. Garrett shifted his weight, not moving toward the supplies. His eyes flicked to the watching women, then back to Rebecca. I'm afraid I can't extend you credit anymore, Mrs. Hayes. The words landed like a physical blow. Rebecca's heart stuttered, but she kept her face impassive, a skill learned in battlefield hospitals, where showing emotion meant losing the patient's trust. May I ask why? Another glance at the watching women. Mrs. Blackwood's mouth was a thin line of disapproval. The mayor's wife whispered something behind her gloved hand to the banker's wife, who nodded vigorously. Given your situation, Garrett's discomfort was palpable. It wouldn't be proper. To encourage that is to appear to condone. Understanding crashed over Rebecca like ice water. Situation. Living under one roof with Lucas Bennett, a man of considerable wealth and no wife. Never mind that his parents were there too. Never mind that she was housing them out of basic human decency. Never mind that nothing improper had occurred. The appearance was damning enough. I see. Rebecca lifted her chin, refusing to show how the words flayed her. Thank you for your propriety, Mr. Garrett. She turned to leave, head high, aware of every eye following her progress to the door. As she reached it, Mrs. Blackwood's voice carried clearly through the sudden silence. Shameless, taking in a wealthy man like that. We all know what she's angling for. Rebecca's hand froze on the door handle. Every instinct screamed to turn around to defend herself, to make them understand. But she'd learned in the war that some battles couldn't be won with words. She walked out into the cold, closed the door gently behind her, and made it approximately 50 yards before her hands started shaking. She didn't tell Lucas what had happened, or his parents. She returned to the cabin with empty hands, and a tight smile claimed she'd decided to wait until next week, when supplies would be fresher. But Eleanor Bennett had lived in small towns long enough to recognize shame when she saw it. That evening, after Rebecca had gone outside to check on Prudence, Eleanor pulled Lucas aside. Something happened in town. Eleanor's voice was quiet but firm. Rebecca came back, diminished somehow. Won't say what, but I can guess. Lucas's jaw tightened. What do you think? You're a wealthy man living under an unmarried woman's roof, Lucas. People talk, especially people who mistake gossip for godliness. She touched his arm. It's not your fault, but your presence here, it costs her, more than she'll ever admit. That night, Lucas lay awake in the loft, listening to the house settle. Downstairs, he could hear Rebecca moving quietly, banking the fire, checking locks, the small rituals of a woman who'd learned to be her own protection. He thought about Caroline, about how Cedar Ridge society had embraced her, the proper rancher's wife, educated, refined, from a good family. They'd celebrated his success, envied his wealth, approved of his marriage. But Rebecca, a widow surviving on stubbornness and skill-taking in charity cases, doing work that left her hands scarred and her dresses patched, she was scandalous. Not because of what she'd done, but because of what they assumed. The hypocrisy burned like acid. The fever came on the fourth night. Lucas woke to the sound of his mother coughing deep, racking coughs that seemed to shake the whole cabin. He descended the ladder to find Eleanor hunched in her bed, behind the curtain, face-flushed body, shaking despite three quilts piled on top of her. Rebecca was already there, hand on Eleanor's forehead, face grave. High fever, probably influenza. It's been going through the county. What do we need? Lucas asked, fear sharp in his throat. Time and luck. Rebecca was already moving heating water, gathering herbs from her carefully organized stores. Willow bark for the fever, honey and thyme for the cough, cool compresses, lots of fluids. She glanced at him. Wake your father, then get me snow-clean snow from the drift by the north wall. They worked through the night. Lucas and William took turns sitting with Eleanor, wiping her burning forehead with snow-cool cloths, spooning broth between her cracked lips when she was lucid enough to swallow. Rebecca moved between them with quiet competence, monitoring pulse and breathing, adjusting the dosage of her herbal remedies, making decisions with the sureness of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. Where did you learn this? Lucas asked during a quiet moment, watching Rebecca mix another batch of fever tea with precise measurements. Her hands stilled for just a moment. The war taught many things. More than most wars, I think. She glanced at him sharply, then back to her work. I was a battlefield nurse with the Union Army, 3 years from 62 to 65. Saw more blood and death in that time than any woman should see in a lifetime. The admission hung in the air between them. Lucas watched her hands resume their work, steady, scarred, capable. These were hands that had held dying men, had performed emergency surgery, had learned medicine in circumstances where mistakes meant death. How old were you? 19 when I joined, 22 when I left. She poured the tea into a cup, tested its temperature. Felt about 100. And then you came here. Not directly, worked in a hospital in Boston for a year after. But the war, it followed me. Every wounded soldier, every fever patient, I saw the fields again, heard the screaming. She paused, cup halfway to Eleanor's lips. Met Samuel at that hospital. He was a veterinarian doing work with the cavalry horses. Kind, gentle. Saw I was drowning and offered me a life far from everything I was running from. And was it far enough? Rebecca's smile was bitter. No place is far enough from what's inside you. But it was quieter here. Simpler. I thought if I could just be Grace Whitmore, the veterinarian's quiet wife, I could forget. Become someone gentle again. Someone who healed instead of just tried to. Eleanor stirred, moaning softly. Rebecca immediately shifted focus, helping her drink, murmuring reassurances. Lucas watched the transformation, the way Rebecca's entire being centered on the patient, the way everything else fell away, except the immediate need. This wasn't just skill, this was calling. When Samuel got the fever, Rebecca continued quietly once Eleanor had settled again. I used everything I'd learned, every technique from the war, every remedy I'd studied. For 3 days, I fought for him. Her voice went flat, emotionless, the tone of someone who'd learned to distance herself from unbearable pain. It wasn't enough. I couldn't save my own husband. That's why you're here, Lucas said, understanding blooming. Why you took in my parents. Why you give everything when you have almost nothing. Because I failed once, Rebecca met his eyes, and I've been trying to make up for it ever since. The rawness in her admission struck Lucas silent. Here was someone else running not from responsibility, like him, but toward it, trying to fill an unfillable void with caregiving, with competence, with the endless attempt to save everyone else because she couldn't save the one person who mattered most. You didn't fail, he said quietly. Didn't I? Disease isn't failure. Death isn't failure. They're just what happens, what we can't control no matter how hard we try. Rebecca laughed, a sound without humor. Says the man who built 3 ranches rather than face an empty nursery. The observation cut deep because it was true. Lucas absorbed the pain, nodded slowly. We're both running then, just in different directions. Maybe. Rebecca turned back to Eleanor, adjusting her blankets. Or maybe we're both trying to outrun the same thing, the unbearable weight of being powerless when it matters most. They sat in silence, then keeping vigil as dawn approached. Outside, the first birds began their morning songs. Inside, Eleanor's breathing grew less labored, her fever dropping degree by careful degree. By the time full daylight came, she was sleeping peacefully, crisis past, danger receding. Rebecca sagged against the wall, exhaustion catching up with her all at once. Lucas handed her a cup of the tea she'd made. You saved her. I delayed the inevitable. But she took the tea, sipped it gratefully. We all die, Mr. Bennett. I just bought her more time. That's what saving means. Buying time, giving life a little longer to be lived. He paused. Caroline and the baby, I couldn't buy them even a minute more. But you gave my mother another morning. Maybe hundreds more. That's not failure, that's everything. Rebecca looked at him, then really looked, seeing past the expensive coat and the empire he'd built. Seeing maybe the man underneath who'd learned that all his wealth and power couldn't protect him from the most fundamental human experiences, loss, grief, the unbearable fragility of the people we love. You understand then, she said softly, what it means to be helpless. I understand that I've been running from that feeling for 2 years. Building bigger, acquiring more, staying busy, all to avoid the moment of stillness where I'd have to admit I was powerless to save them. And now, Lucas looked at his mother breathing steadily under her quilts, at his father asleep in the rocking chair, one worn hand resting protectively on his wife's arm, at Rebecca, face shadowed with exhaustion, but eyes alert, still watching over her patience even as she swayed with fatigue. Now I'm learning that being present in the powerlessness is braver than running from it. Rebecca's eyes glistened. She looked away quickly, blinking hard. You should sleep. I'll watch her. We'll both watch. Lucas settled into the chair opposite Warren. You taught me bread can't be made without strength. Maybe healing can't be done alone either. A ghost of a smile crossed Rebecca's face. She didn't argue. They sat together as morning light filled the cabin, two people who'd been running in different directions, finally standing still long enough to see each other clearly. 4 days later, as Eleanor continued her steady recovery, riders appeared on the horizon. Rebecca saw them first from the cabin window, 4 men on horseback moving with the deliberate pace of people on official business. Her stomach dropped. Lucas, her voice carried warning. He joined her at the window, and she felt him tense as he recognized the lead rider. Reverend Blackwood and the town council. What do they want? Nothing good. The riders dismounted with ceremonial slowness. Reverend Thomas Blackwood was a tall man, broad-shouldered with silver hair, and the kind of commanding presence that made people instinctively defer. Behind him came the mayor, the banker, and the land office clerk, pillars of Cedar Ridge society, arbiters of propriety, enforcers of the unwritten rules that govern frontier morality. Rebecca opened the door before they could knock. Gentlemen, her voice was ice, state your business. Reverend R. Blackwood removed his hat, his face arranged in an expression of sorrowful concern that didn't reach his eyes. Mrs. Hayes, we've come to speak with Mr. Bennett about a matter of some delicacy. Then speak. Lucas appeared behind Rebecca, and she felt the warmth of his presence, the solidarity. The Reverend's eyes flicked between them, cataloging the proximity, the familiarity, filing it away as evidence. Mr. Bennett, this arrangement is unseemly. You're a man of considerable standing in this community. Mrs. Hayes is a widow, respectable, certainly, but vulnerable to gossip. You're living under one roof without proper supervision. Rebecca felt rage building like steam in a kettle. Get off my land. Blackwood blinked thrown. Mrs. Hayes, I said get off my land. She stepped forward and the men actually stepped back. You come here with your concern and your judgment, but where were you when I was starving last winter? Where were you when Samuel died in the bank? She jabbed a finger at the banker who had the grace to look uncomfortable. Tried to take everything. Where were you when your respectability could have actually helped someone? The mayor, a round man with mutton chops, cleared his throat. We're only thinking of your reputation, Mrs. Hayes. The talk in town is created by people who mistake cruelty for godliness, who think sitting in judgment is the same as sitting in fellowship. Her voice shook now, years of suppressed anger finding voice. I don't need your concern. I don't need your judgment. And I queer in hell don't need you telling me who can stay in my home. One of the councilmen, red-faced and pompous, turned to Lucas. Mr. Bennett, surely you see the impropriety. For your own reputation, if not for hers, you must either leave or make your intentions honorable. The words hung in the frigid air like a noose. This was the moment. The choice between safety and vulnerability, between the carefully constructed walls Lucas had built, and the messy, terrifying prospect of opening his heart again. Rebecca turned to face him, waiting. Her green eyes were guarded now, prepared for abandonment, expecting it even. She'd been left before by death, by circumstance, by a society that took from her without giving back. Why should this be different? Lucas opened his mouth. The words he should say were right there, declarations of intent, promises of marriage, the easy path that would satisfy these men and protect Rebecca's reputation. But fear froze them in his throat. Fear of commitment, of loss, of risking everything again, only to have it torn away. He'd built walls for a reason. They'd kept him safe, kept him functional, kept him from drowning in the grief that waited whenever he stood still. The silence stretched. 1 second, 2, 5. Rebecca's face transformed soft hope hardening to stone understanding to armor. Go, Mr. Bennett. Her voice was cold as the winter wind that had brought him here. You're good at that. Inside the cabin behind the door, Lucas heard his mother begin to cry softly. Shame radiated from the doorway where William stood, unable even to look at his son. Lucas looked at Rebecca, at the hurt blooming in her eyes like frost on glass, at the walls slamming back into place, at the woman who'd taught him about presence, choosing in this moment to protect herself from his absence. He wanted to speak, wanted to fight, wanted to be the man she deserved, the man his parents had raised him to be. Instead, he turned away, walked to his horse, mounted up, aware of every eye on him, condemning, pitying, seeing his failure written in the slump of his shoulders. Reverend Blackwood and his entourage followed, satisfied with their work, convinced they'd saved Cedar Ridge from scandal. Lucas rode down the mountain toward his empty empire, hating himself more with every step. Behind him, the cabin door closed with a sound like finality. Inside, Rebecca sank into the rocking chair. His chair, the one that had waited for him, and stared at the fire, while outside, the man who'd almost learned to stay chose running after all. The Crawford Ranch was exactly as Lucas had left it, sprawling, impressive, empty as a tomb. 3,000 acres of prime grazing land, a house that could sleep 20 in comfort, barns that held equipment worth more than most men made in a lifetime, all of it meaningless. Lucas sat in his study for 3 days, staring at account ledgers that no longer made sense. His foreman came with reports, cattle counts, weather predictions, supply needs. Lucas signed what needed signing, approved what needed approving, went through the motions of being the empire builder he'd created. But the empire felt like a prison now. On the fourth night, whiskey bottle half empty beside him, Lucas found himself standing outside the nursery door, the door he'd locked 2 years ago and sworn never to open. His hands shook as he fitted the key into the lock. The room beyond was exactly as they'd left it. Dust covered everything like a shroud, like time itself had been suspended. The cradle sat in this corner, a folded quilt draped over its edge, yellow, because they hadn't known if the baby would be a boy or girl. They'd planned to decide on names after the birth, had wanted to see the face first to know the soul before naming it. They'd never gotten the chance. A rocking horse stood sentinel by the window, painted white with a red saddle, waiting for a child who would never ride it. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books he'd never read aloud, fairy tales and adventure stories, and a leather-bound collection of Shakespeare that had belonged to Caroline's father. Toys that would never know a child's laughter gathered dust on their pristine shelves. Lucas sank to his knees in the middle of the room and wept. He wept for the baby who'd lived 3 hours, 3 impossibly brief hours, where they'd held her, counted her tiny fingers, whispered promises to a daughter who was already leaving. He wept for Caroline, who'd smiled at him even as the light left her eyes, who'd whispered, "Take care of our girl," with her last breath, not knowing their girl would follow her before the sunset. He wept for 2 years of running, of building, of trying to outpace grief that had no mercy and respected no boundaries. He wept for the family he'd abandoned in his flight from pain, his parents who'd lost their son while he was still breathing, who'd been left to age alone while he constructed monuments to his own avoidance. He wept for Rebecca, the woman who'd shown him what courage looked like, who'd taught him that presence was worth more than all his accumulated wealth, who'd offered him a second chance at being human, and whom he'd abandoned when it mattered most. And in the weeping, something broke, or maybe something healed. The distinction was impossible to determine. What Lucas knew, kneeling in the dust of dreams long dead, was that he was done running. Carolyn and their daughter were gone. That pain would never leave, would be part of him, always a scar that ached when storms came, a memory that surfaced in quiet moments. But Rebecca had been right about stillness. You couldn't heal while running. Healing required staying in one place long enough for the wounds to close, for new growth to take root, for life to remember how to continue. Lucas stood on unsteady legs. He walked to the cradle, ran his fingers over the yellow quilt. "I'm sorry I locked you away," he whispered to Ghost. "I thought forgetting would hurt less, but it just meant I never properly said goodbye." He gathered the quilt, hand-stitched by Caroline during those hopeful months, each stitch a prayer for a future that never came. He would keep it, he decided. Not locked away, but present. A reminder that love once existed here, that hope had lived in this room, that grief itself was proof of something precious lost. But he wouldn't live in this room anymore. Wouldn't let it remain a shrine to what couldn't be changed. It was time to live for what still could be. The message came at dawn, delivered by a rider Lucas didn't recognize, a young man, maybe 18, with the weathered face of someone who'd grown up hard. "Your father's dying." No preamble, no softening. Just fact delivered flat. "Mrs. Hayes sent me. Said to tell you, come or don't. Your choice." Then he was gone, leaving Lucas alone with the words in their unbearable weight. Not an accident, not sudden illness, but dying the slow kind, the inevitable kind that came from exhaustion and hunger, and cold, taking their toll on an aging body that had been pushed past its limits. Lucas didn't pack, didn't hesitate, didn't even close the door behind him. He saddled his horse, loaded a wagon with supplies, flour, salt, coffee, sugar, blankets, medicine, wood, everything he could think of, and rode for Cedar Ridge like demons were chasing him. Maybe they were. The demons of all his failures, all his abandonments, all the moments he'd chosen pride over presence. But first, he had to stop somewhere. No. The cemetery sat on a hill overlooking Cedar Ridge, peaceful even in winter's grip. Simple markers dotted the snow-covered ground, most wooden, some stone, the all bearing witness to the frontier's harsh arithmetic of life and death. Carolyn's grave was near the back, beneath a young oak that would someday provide shade, but now stood bare and vulnerable against the sky. The headstone was modest. Lucas had been too shattered to do more than order something simple. Carolyn Elizabeth Bennett, 1855 to 1881. Beloved wife and mother. Too brief, too precious. Snow covered it now. Lucas brushed it away with bare hands, feeling the bite of cold, welcoming the pain as penance. "I've been running from you." His voice cracked in the winter silence. "From the baby, from everything we lost. I thought if I kept moving, kept building, I could somehow outrun the pain of that day." A raven called from the oak above. Otherwise silence. "But I can't. The pain follows because it's part of loving you. Part of having had something so precious that losing it broke me." He traced her name on the cold stone. "I thought I was honoring you by succeeding, by building an empire. But all I was doing was hiding." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and cold earth. "I met someone." The words came hard but necessary. "A woman who's teaching me what you tried to teach me, that being present matters more than being powerful. That stillness isn't weakness. That love means risking the pain of loss because the alternative is never loving at all." Lucas pulled the yellow quilt from his saddlebag, the one Caroline had made. He wrapped it around the headstone gently, like tucking in a child. "I can't bring you back. Can't bring our daughter back. But I can stop wasting the life you gave me by being too afraid to live it." His voice strengthened. "You were brave enough to hope for our baby even knowing the dangers. Brave enough to smile at me even when you knew you were dying. The least I can do is be brave enough to hope again." He stood, touched the headstone one last time. "Thank you for teaching me to love. I'm sorry it took me so long to remember how." The raven called again, took flight, circled once over the cemetery before heading toward the mountains. Lucas watched it disappear, feeling lighter than he had in 2 years. Then he mounted his horse and rode toward the woman who'd shown him what courage looked like, toward the family he'd abandoned, toward the hardest conversation of his life, toward home. The cabin looked smaller than Lucas remembered, or maybe he was seeing it differently now, not as a temporary shelter, but as the place where he'd started learning to be human again. Smoke curled from the chimney. The wagon he'd sent ahead sat empty by the door, supplies already unloaded. Rebecca stood on the porch, arms crossed against the cold. Her face was composed, careful, giving nothing away. Behind her through the window, Lucas could see his mother moving around inside. At least she was well enough to be up. But his father, how is he? Lucas dismounted, hat in hand. Alive, barely. Rebecca's voice was professional, distant. The warmth that had started growing between them had frozen over completely. Exhaustion, malnutrition, exposure. His heart's weak. I'm doing what I can, but at his age, she left the sentence unfinished. They both knew what it meant. I brought supplies. Everything you asked for. More. I see that. The wagon came yesterday. No thank you. No acknowledgement beyond fact. Lucas swallowed hard. Rebecca, your father's inside. He's been asking for you and... She turned to go, then stopped without looking back. Though I told him not to count on you showing up. People who leave usually stay gone. The words were a knife between his ribs, perfectly aimed. Lucas absorbed the pain, knew he deserved it, and more. I came back. You did, said. Now she turned, and her eyes were cold as the wind off the mountains. The question is, for how long? Until the next hard choice, until someone asks you to commit to something more than money and supplies. Save it, Mr. Bennett. She pulled her shawl tighter. Your father's in the bedroom. I suggest you stop talking and start being present for once. She brushed past him into the cabin, leaving Lucas standing in the snow with his failures and his inadequate words. The bedroom, really just a curtained-off corner of the main room, was dim and smelled of sickness and herbs. William Bennett lay on the narrow bed, looking impossibly small beneath the quilts. His breathing was shallow, labored, each inhale a visible struggle. Lucas pulled up a chair, the same chair he'd sat in while learning to mend his father's coat. He took William's hand, so light now, so fragile, like holding a bird. Pa, it's me, Lucas. William's eyes opened slowly, taking a long moment to focus. When they did, something like surprise crossed his weathered face. Son? The word was barely a whisper. You came. Of course I came. Did you? A weak smile, more sad than bitter. Wasn't so sure. You've been choosing other things for a while now. The accusation carried no heat, which somehow made it worse. This was simple statement of fact, observation without anger, the truth stripped of everything but its bones. I'm sorry, Pa, for everything, for leaving you, for choosing my empire over my family, for being so afraid of feeling anything that I stopped being able to feel everything. William's fingers tightened slightly on Lucas's hand. Grace, Rebecca, she's a good woman, strong, kind, seen things, survived things that would break most people. I know. Don't let her go. Each word was an effort. Don't be the fool I raised you not to be. I was a fool, Pa. When those men came, when they asked me to choose, I froze. I was so afraid. Fear ain't the problem. William's breathing grew more labored. Fear's natural, being brave enough to act despite it. That's what matters. Lucas blinked back, tears. I'm here now, and I'm not leaving again. Whatever you need, whatever any of you need, I'm here. Good. William's eyes drifted closed. About time you came home. The next 3 days were a blur of caregiving. Lucas and Rebecca worked in careful synchronization, speaking only when necessary, moving around each other with practiced efficiency. She showed him how to prepare the medicinal teas, how to monitor William's pulse and breathing, how to read the signs of improvement or decline. William rallied slowly, degree by painful degree. The tonics helped. The rest helped. But mostly Lucas suspected what helped was no longer being alone and abandoned. Eleanor hovered near her husband's bedside when she was strong enough, holding his hand, singing Welsh hymns in a voice thin but sweet. She never mentioned Lucas's departure, never spoke of his failure to choose. But sometimes he caught her looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, disappointment and hope warring for dominance. Rebecca remained professionally distant, speaking to Lucas only about patient care, never about anything personal. The walls she'd built were thick and high, reinforced by his abandonment. Lucas didn't push, didn't try to explain or justify. He simply stayed. Chopped wood, hauled water, made bread, changed bedding. Did the thousand small tasks that keeping people alive required, being present, like she taught him. On the fourth day, William sat up for the first time. Color had returned to his face. His breathing came easier. Rebecca examined him with careful thoroughness, then nodded. Better. Not out of danger, but better. William looked at Lucas with clear eyes. You stayed. Yes, sir. Even though it's hard. Even though she won't talk to you. Lucas glanced at Rebecca's back as she organized medicines. I'm not doing it for thanks, Pa. I'm doing it because it's right. Because you're my family. Because I've wasted enough time on pride and fear. William smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. You're learning, son. About time, but you're learning. That evening, as Rebecca prepared supper, Eleanor pulled Lucas aside. The town's going to hear you're back. They'll come again, those men, with their judgment and their demands. Let them come. It's not you they'll hurt, Lucas. It's Rebecca. They'll tear her reputation to shreds. I know. Lucas watched Rebecca move around the kitchen with tired grace. And I know what needs to be done about it. Eleanor studied his face. You're sure? Because if you run again... I won't. I'm done running, Ma. From grief, from responsibility, from the hardest and best known parts of being alive. He met his mother's eyes. I love her. I don't know when it happened. Maybe when she yelled at me for trying to buy decency. Maybe when she showed me how to make bread. Maybe when she sat up all night saving you. But I love her, and I'm not going to let fear make me lose her the way it made me lose 2 years with you in play. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. She pulled Lucas into a fierce hug. Then you know what you have to do. Yes, ma'am. Sunday's coming. I know. The whole town will be there. Good. Lucas held his mother close, feeling her frailty and her strength. Let them all hear it. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of winter day where every breath crystallized in distance was deceptive in the sharp air. Cedar Ridge Church sat on Main Street, white-clapboard, with a modest steeple, bells already ringing to call the faithful to service. Lucas rode into town alone, wearing his best suit, but no longer caring what it cost or what it represented. The horse's breath made clouds in the cold air. People on the street stared as he passed, whispers following in his wake like ripples behind a boat. He tied his horse outside the church and waited, watched as families filed in, farmers and merchants, ranchers and tradesmen, the wives and their Sunday-best children scrubbed and squirming. Watched as Reverend Blackwood arrived, looking satisfied and righteous, ready to deliver whatever sermon he had prepared about morality and propriety. Watched as Rebecca came walking up the street, flanked by Eleanor and William. His father was still weak, leaning heavily on a walking stick, but upright and determined. His mother held Rebecca's arms, supporting and being supported, a unit of their own. Rebecca saw Lucas and stopped. Her expression shuddered, wary. Rebecca, he stepped forward. Will you come inside with me? I don't think... Please, just trust me, one more time. She looked at Eleanor, who nodded encouragingly, at William, who smiled, then back at Lucas, searching his face for the lie, the escape route, the inevitable abandonment. Whatever she saw made her shoulders drop slightly. One more time, a warning and a permission. They walked into the church together and every head turned. The sanctuary was packed, every pew-filled standing room only in the back. Reverend Blackwood stood at the pulpit, mid-sermon voice carrying across the congregation with practiced resonance. He saw Lucas and Rebecca enter and faltered, losing his place. Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Hayes. The greeting was stiff, formal. How unexpected. Lucas didn't sit, didn't wait for permission. He walked down the center aisle, boots echoing on the wooden floor. Rebecca's hand in his parents following behind. He stopped at the front, turned to face the congregation. Every eye in Cedar Ridge fixed on him. The silence was absolute. No coughs, no whispers, no restless children. Just breath held waiting. I have something to say. Lucas announced, his voice steady and clear. Reverend and Blackwood blinked. Mr. Bennett, this is highly irregular. I'm in the middle of... This won't take long. Lucas turned back to the assembled town, to the people who judged and gossiped and condemned. You call her shameless, Rebecca Hayes. You say she's improper, angling for a wealthy man's money, living in sin. He paused, letting the accusations hang in the air. You're right about one thing, someone in this story is shameless, but it's not her. Rebecca's hand tightened on his. He squeezed back an anchor. Rebecca Hayes fed my parents when I abandoned them to build my empire. She shared her last meal while I sent money and excuses from my 12-room mansion. She gave everything, her food, her warmth, her home, her reputation, while I hid behind wealth and pride and fear. The mayor shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Blackwood's face had gone pale, but Lucas wasn't finished. She saved my mother's life with skills she learned serving this country as a Union battlefield nurse. 3 years in hell watching boy die learning medicine under conditions most of you can't imagine. She did her duty, came home, and tried to build a quiet life. And when my parents needed help, she gave it without hesitation, without condition, without thought for what it might cost her. He looked at Henry Garrett, who'd turned away his business, at the banker who'd threatened to take her land, at the council members who demanded he leave or marry. And what did Cedar Ridge do? Gossiped, judged, turned away her business, questioned her virtue, made her choice to show basic human decency into a scandal. His voice rose, filling the church. If you want to judge someone, judge me. I'm the one who valued money over family. I'm the one who thought running from pain was easier than facing it. I'm the one who abandoned the people who needed me most. Mrs. Blackwood stood up, face flushed. Mr. Bennett, we were only concerned for propriety. Propriety, Lucas's laugh was harsh. Is it proper to let elderly people defreeze rather than take them in because of what people might think? Is it proper to destroy a woman's livelihood because she chose compassion over reputation? Is it proper to drive away the best person in this town because she didn't fit your narrow definition of acceptable behavior? He turned, found Rebecca's eyes. They were bright with unshed tears, her face a mix of emotions he couldn't fully read. Rebecca Hayes, I'm asking you in front of this whole town, not because I need to make them happy, but because I need them to witness this, to know that I'm choosing you, publicly, completely, without reservation or escape route. The church held its collective breath. I'm asking you to let me stay, not because you need me, you've proven you don't need anyone, but because I need you. You taught me what presence means, what courage looks like, what it means to give without counting the cost. His voice softened. You taught me how to be still, how to heal, how to be enough. Rebecca stared at him, chest heaving with emotion. Around them, the congregation waited in suspension, this moment balanced on a knife's edge. I don't need their approval, Rebecca said quietly, but her voice carried in the absolute silence. Or their pity. Lucas waited hard, hammering against his ribs. But I'll take a man who's learned to chop wood. A hint of a smile touched her lips. Who knows the difference between presence and payment? Who's brave enough to be still? She stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and placed her hand in his. The church erupted. Gasps, murmurs, scattered applause from the back where the working folks sat, the ones who understood scarcity and sacrifice. Reverend Blackwood opened his mouth, opened it again. Well, he finally managed. I suppose congratulations are in order. But Lucas barely heard him. He was looking at Rebecca, at the walls coming down in her eyes, at the cautious hope blooming on her face, at the woman who'd saved him in every way that mattered. I love you, he whispered low enough that only she could hear. I should have said it sooner, should have been brave enough to say it when those men came. But I'm saying it now in front of everyone, so there's no doubt. I love you, Rebecca Hayes. Tears spilled down her cheeks. You're an idiot, Lucas Bennett. I know. You hurt me when you left. I know. And I'll spend the rest of my life making up for it if you'll let me. She pulled him down and kissed him there in front of Cedar Ridge Church, in front of Gon and the Reverend and the entire scandalized, mesmerized congregation. When they broke apart, the church was in chaos. Half the congregation looked shocked, a quarter looked delighted, and the rest looked like they were trying to decide which reaction was proper. Lucas didn't care. He took Rebecca's hand, his parents fell in beside them, and they walked down the aisle together. Out the door, into the cold sunlight, into whatever came next. Behind them, the whispers started immediately, but mixed with them now were other sounds. Approval, admiration, the grudging respect of people who just witnessed someone choose vulnerability over safety, love over fear. It wasn't universal acceptance. Some would never forgive. The scandal would always see impropriety where there was only compassion. But it was a start. Spring came late to Wyoming that year, but when it arrived, it brought abundance. The snow melted in rushing streams that fed the creek. Wildflowers erupted from the newly thawed ground, Indian paintbrush, and columbine lupine and fireweed painting the meadows in riot of color. The cabin had grown. Lucas and William had built a proper addition, 2 more rooms, and a real porch that wrapped around the front. Rebecca's garden plot expanded ready for planting. A new barn housed Prudence and 2 new milk goats Lucas had bought from old Jack Miller. The town had come around slowly. A few families, first the working folks who understood hardship and respected resilience. They'd brought supplies, offered help with the building, shared meals. Then more families. Then grudgingly, even some of the ones who judged hardest. Henry Garrett had shown up one afternoon, hat in hand, face red with shame. He'd apologized, cleared Rebecca's debt, and asked if she'd consider being the town's official medical consultant, paid position, respect included. She'd accepted. Reverend Blackwood had visited too, though his apology was stiffer, more theological than heartfelt. But he'd asked if Rebecca would help tend to sick parishioners, which she took as progress. Forgiveness? Lucas learned it wasn't instant. It was earned in small moments, quiet actions, steady presence over time. Like bread rising, like crops growing, like trust, rebuilding after betrayal. It was patient work. He was learning patience. Inside the expanded cabin, a room waited. Not the room from Lucas's mansion. He'd sold that house, couldn't bear to live in that monument to avoidance. This was a new room built with his own hands and his father's guidance made with hope instead of grief. A cradle sat in the corner, carved by William from pine smooth and strong. Eleanor had sewn quilts, not yellow this time, but blue and green, the colors of Wyoming spring. Books lined a small shelf, and a rocking horse, the one from the old nursery rescued and repainted, stood by the window. This room wasn't haunted by the past. It was ready for the future. One evening in May, as sunset painted the mountains gold and pink, the 4 of them sat on the new porch. Eleanor rocked gently in her chair, knitting a tiny blanket. Blue and white soft wool, each stitch a prayer. William carved a toy horse from pine, his hands sure and steady again, health mostly restored. The knife moved with practiced ease, creating something beautiful from raw wood. Rebecca leaned against Lucas's shoulder, watching the day end. Her hand rested on her belly, still flat, but they'd learned that morning from her missed cycle and the particular kind of exhaustion she recognized from nursing pregnant women. It was early, too early to be certain, to make announcements, to hope too hard. But hope was there anyway, fragile and fierce, growing in the spaces grief had left behind. "You came home, son," Eleanor said softly, her needles clicking in rhythm with the rocking chair. Finally came home. Lucas looked at the people around him, his parents aging, but present, healed in body and spirit. Rebecca strong and sure, choosing each day to let him stay, to trust him with her heart, despite how he'd failed her. The land stretching out before them, old and beautiful and full of promise. "Took me long enough," he admitted. Rebecca smiled, the expression transforming her face. "Long roads find home too. Sometimes the wandering is part of the journey." William held up the carved horse, examining his work in the fading light. "For the future," he said with a twinkle in his eye, and Lucas knew his father understood about the pregnancy, the hope, the second chance they'd been given. Lucas took Rebecca's hand, lacing their fingers together. The wind carried the scent of wildflowers and fresh-turned earth, of pine and possibility. Birds sang their evening songs, and the mountains stood eternal, witnessing this small human moment of connection and healing. They sat together as darkness fell gently, a family forged not by blood alone, but by choice and sacrifice and love, that had learned to bloom in the hardest soil. Built not from perfection, but from failure, transformed into growth, from wounds that became wisdom, from running that finally blessedly became standing still. The rocking chair that had waited so long, the one that had held Lucas during his learning, that had been empty during his absence, that had witnessed his return, was filled now. Not with one person, but with all of them together, their combined weight making it creak gently, rhythmically, like a heartbeat. Like home. Lucas breathed in the mountain air, felt Rebecca's warmth against his side, heard his mother's soft singing, blend with the evening bird calls, watched his father work with patient hands. This was what empire looked like, he thought. Not acres or cattle or money in the bank, But this connection presence, love given and received, family chosen and cherished. This was what mattered. This was enough. This was home. Thank you for journeying with us through Lucas and Rebecca's story of redemption and healing. If this tale of second chances and hard-won love touched your heart, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channels for more emotionally powerful Western tales. Share in the comments below. Have you ever had to choose between running from pain or facing it head on? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, remember that the longest journey is often the one that leads us home, and sometimes home is built not by what we own, but by who we choose to become.